Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us here this afternoon in this rather warm Bonn zone. So I think Bonn is definitely trying to imitate Fiji climate. I saw some beautiful flowers over there on that side, and I think it's really exciting that we actually have the Fiji organized Conference of the Parties 23 here in Bonn. My name is Martin Visbeck. I'm an oceanographer from the Helmholtz Center for Ocean Research here in Kiel in Germany, and I have the pleasure to introduce you to our joint session this afternoon. It's about catalyzing climate action, realizing the Sustainable Development Goals, and we want to talk about science and the interconnections and implementation on this agenda. Now, there's no news to you that we live in interesting times. In 2015, the international community made what I think a groundbreaking decision on two areas. On the one hand, we have the Paris Agreement that will be very much in the center of the debates here at the COP23 meeting. And on the other hand, in the same year, there was also an agreement reached at the United Nations about the Agenda 2030, about the Sustainable Development Goals. And on the one hand here, we're going to debate the ambition of the nations, action on climate. We saw civil society around Bonn the last 2 days really pushing the German government and all the governments around the world for more activity, more engaging in climate mitigation, dealing with climate adaptation. But at the same time, I think we also want to realize that although climate is a major challenge, but it's not the only challenge that society is facing, and the Sustainable Development Goals, I think, are a nice framework to connecting the two. I want to start with an image that shows just the evolution of humanity. That's the number of people on our planet, a little bit stratified by regions. And there's what is amazing that in my lifetime, the number of people on our planet has doubled from 3.5 billion to 7.5 by now. And I think that's a huge accomplishment of global societies on the one hand, but it also comes with issues. And energy systems that produce CO2 are the ones that we debate here a lot, but there's other challenges as well. Now, when you look ahead, you will see that more is coming. We think that probably between 8 and 10 billion people will be on the planet by 2050, and this stratifies the rise in population by regions, and it shows in particular in the developing world as we're going to see the majority of the growth. So I think also dealing with the challenges that go along with that, climate and otherwise, means that it's not just an OECD problem, it's a global problem. In particular, solutions will have to be thought about that work both in the developed and in the developing world. On the other hand, for the next foreseeable future, I think we have one planet, our ocean, the blue marble, and the land around it. And I think, to me, what's interesting is, well, what is then the development in climate, in biodiversity, in poverty reduction, and other dimension of equity? The planetary boundaries just look at the physical ocean space, reminding us that this is a finite space for us to share. And I like the Oxfam circle, which connects the physical outer boundaries with the inner core values of human development. And so I think, academically speaking, well, how will this go? What is a fair and just operating space for our planet? And do we have ideas? I would like the panel to reflect on that on the climate side as well on the development side. I happen to think that this calls for system science, integrated system science, not just on the climate side, but actually realizing the whole 2030 agenda. And I think we want our panel here to reflect on those debates. Now, we've been thinking about some of these things with the German Science Foundation. We went to the UN a few years back and thought about, in particular, the role of science in sustainable development and climate. We are a reflective business, but there's also measuring indicators as one of the frameworks that we discussed. We had another meeting, which I think we were very excited about, and Imme joined us for that as well, in the Villa Vergoni. It's a very nice place in northern Italy, where we really thought how we can connect these issues, sustainable development, climate, planetary challenges, and a nice report was produced that we would love to share with you. And I think it led to another insight that many people say in sustainability, everything is connected with everything. Now, scientists find that attractive. because it means it's exciting, interesting, we can do a lot of science. Politicians say, oh, that's a good reason not to move, because I can't solve everything. And I think what this report from the International Council for Science does is exactly work on that space and saying, well, some things are connected more than others. Some actions on climate and food and poverty elevation go hand in hand, and other actions are sort of don't go hand in hand. So I think we can navigate that space a bit more intelligently. Rather than saying everything is connected, we can point out the connectivity in which way it goes, and we see joined up agendas. And I think it's the joined up agenda that we really want to focus on here this afternoon. So I invite you to look at that ICSU report if you want to read more about it. Now, almost done. There's various different exciting projects out there. On the one hand, I'm personally a big fan of IPCC. The climate assessment's been around for 20 years, helped the global community to understand what climate is, to have the physical basis for that. It even talks about economic shifts and regimes. I think there's a lot of agreement on the challenge. There's diversity of opinion on the action, and that will be debated here. So pathways help, but it's also true for biodiversity, and there's a group of us who want to think about not just the climate pathway, but also how we make sense of and meet the Sustainable Development Goals towards a more equitable future that fulfills not just the climate need, but also the other aspirations of the 2030 Agenda. Almost done. So there's two scientific networks that I want to highlight. On the one hand is the World Climate Research Program, and a more newer program is Future Earth. And what Future Earth tries to do is connect all the various ends of sciences, but not just the academic science, but also other knowledge systems in practitioner domains, in other knowledge systems, and really together think about these future challenges, again, climate being one of them, another there. So we're trying to do more solution-oriented, joined-up research, and there is a particular avenue that Future Earth is promoting that in by what they call knowledge action networks. But again, that's an implementation step. These are networks where scientists, actors in society come together, think about ways towards sustainability, and certainly climate is that integral space between the Agenda 2030 and climate change, what we're debating here at the COP23. So this afternoon, we have a wonderful panel here. We're going to have two short presentations from Maria and Leena here, giving us their views on how these joined-up agendas, how we can really combine action on climate and climate mitigation, climate adaptation with the 2030 Agenda. And then we'll have a wonderful panel that moderates, that speaks about these issues from various perspectives. And I'm very glad that we managed to win Imme Scholz, and Imme will be moderating this panel this afternoon. So it's my task now, Imme, to introduce you. She works for the German Development Institute here in Bonn, and I would like you to come up to the stage and introduce the panelists and moderate the session. So thanks for coming. I'm looking forward to an exciting discussion this afternoon.
Thank you, Martin. And in case you don't know him, Martin, because you weren't introduced actually, Martin. So Martin Visbeck is an oceanographer, a marine scientist, and he is also the chairman of the German Committee of Future Earth. So, and also on the Leadership Council of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and a member of the Scientific Committee of the World Climate Research Program. So Future Earth and World Climate Research Program are both embodied in you, so you were the right person to make the introduction here. So thank you. Now I would like to invite Maria Amparo from Mexico, Maria Amparo Martinez Arroyo. She has a PhD in ecology from the University of Barcelona, and she is the Director General of the Mexican National Institute of Ecology and Climate Change, and a member of the Mexican delegation. So please share your thoughts with us.
With this, I change the slides?
Probably there, the big button.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much to the organizers to invite me to this really nice meeting. Well, the topic that we will talk about is really a matter of concern of, I think, every government now, because everybody knows, and when I saw the slide, it was the same, because, well, it's that idea that how we arrive here. We arrive here because so many years in the contemporary history, governments said the very, very relevant groups like Club of Roma, need to know more than the political information or the geographical information of demographics tell them. And they asked science, they asked what would be the forecast of the future, if the planet would have limits or not. And in the modern history, I think that it was a very important example of the relationship between science and the decision makers. And well, so on. We have a lot of examples. I have not to convince any that is here about this thematic. It's only to put in the same channel. But what is important also with this, that in this moment with topics like the SDGs, like the Paris Agreement, like all the issues that we are discussing here, we need facts. We need to talk about what is really happening. It's not a matter of alternative truths, it's not a matter of opinions, it's a matter to know, to account, to measure, to have monitoring systems, to have observation systems, and to have facts. Of course, you know all of this. I won't describe it, but there are facts that are enough convincing to tell us that we have to act, and that we have to take the science, the observations, the numbers as a political, as a policy based on science. It's another example that how the IPCC as a symbolic institution, international institution, panel intergovernmental, has links with the decision makers in many ways. We have all the assessment reports that IPCC have done, and we can see what were the main inputs for what result. And well, we are agree that we need all a very, very complex system to arrive to decisions all around the world. But we have another reality. We have we have the universities, the scientific centers in each country, and this complexity of the topics that we are talking about is really requiring a change in the mind, in the practice, in all the work that we are doing in the scientific institutions, in the research institutions. But it's also a need of a change in the mind of the decision makers. And we are in some places, in some countries, there is a tradition to a science that is linked to the policymakers. But in many of the countries, like in my region and my country, in Latin America and in Mexico particularly, we are building that bridge, because we used to have separated words, and we were not touching very much. Then now that for one side climate modeling has developed very quickly, is we need still how to interpret that results by the decision makers. To work in the uncertainty is not the best place for the decision makers or for the politicians. Is that scientists are the place where they used to stay, the uncertainty, the theories, the hypotheses. Here is very complicated to talk the same language when you have to take decisions. Then this is one of the main topics that we are trying to find linkages with the scientists and the decision makers in our case. We know that to decision making, we have the need now in climate change, in environment in general, and I would think that in everything, but in this moment we are talking only about the sustainable development and climate change. But we need informed analytical approach to have options for the decision makers, because we don't need only one point of view or coming from only one discipline. We need to have an holistic point of view to take decisions. And also in the climate change science and in the sustainable development science is very dynamic. We have a process where we are learning many things at the same time, and we have to construct many iterative politics that we can to make reviews and to change the strategies that to fit it to the new information. We have two main. There is many conventions, many international conventions, but we have this where we need an approach. I want to say only what was the approach that in Mexico we are taking to do that. In the first place, we need a change in our institutional framework, and then with a general law of climate change that we established in 2012, we put a lot of institutions in the way to make transversal policies. And in that arrangement that you can see there are interministerial, there are the Congress, there are in each state or entity in our country has the same structure. But we have a National Institute of Ecology and Climate Change, where we are integrating all the knowledge, the technological knowledge and scientific knowledge, and also, of course, of the social science, to put in a way to be used for decision makers. Well, then there is one of the parts. Then the institute has a lot of linkages with the universities, with a lot of institutions, and also we have externally at international level. Also, we are the focal points for many of the scientific or technical institutions. That is. In general, well, when the AIA of global change research, we have that kind of relationship, and we think that we need a lot of things, a lot of meetings, but to have the right arrangement where the institutions can meet, where we can talk and we can exchange information and opinions, can be a first step to go further. And well, at the end, I think as the colleague that was talking when I arrived. Of course, this is a complex and transdisciplinary problems that we have to solve at the same time. If we have the SDGs, and we have among the SDGs, one is climate, but there are a lot that are as climate transversal to all the others. Then what we are trying to do is to put in all the government at federal level and at subnational level all the goals that have to be taken together, and of course that need action together to do that. Then that's what I was sharing with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria Amparo. And I now would like to invite Leena Shrivastava from TERI University. She's an economist and also executive director at TERI and chancellor of the TERI University, and on the executive committee of Sustainable Energy for All. Please come. For Sustainable Energy for All, and gives advice to many important policy initiatives, to UNEP, WWF, and please, floor is yours. Is someone else?
Yes, there we are. Thank you very much, Imme, and would also like to start by thanking the organizers for this opportunity. I'm going to keep my presentation very short and jump straight into the essence of what it is that I would like to share with you. We are talking about science here. Let me just move forward to the slides that I do want to use, and I'll start from here. So the one thing that I thought I should mention in the beginning is that science of climate change has done, and the scientists have done a wonderful job in both creating the science and communicating the science, which is why we are where we are as far as the Paris Agreement is concerned. But to me, it seems that what we have achieved at a global level, I think as Maria alluded to as well in her presentation, needs to translate to a national level as well. Because what do we tend to do? We tend to take what is given as solutions at a macro level, at a certain level of abstraction, and then translate that into national action without necessarily the science to back it up. But when you bring something down from a global level to a national level to a local level where it needs to be implemented, you need to have a much greater degree of granularity in your understanding. And that is something that I often find missing. So I'm going to share that with you in the next couple of slides only. And I hope to be able to finish in 5 minutes. And Imme is going to keep me on time, she says. So these are extracts from what India put forward as its national development commitments. We spoke about reducing our emissions intensity by about 30 to 35% to achieve about 40% cumulative electric power installed from non-fossil based energy to create an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons, which is quite a large range actually, and so on. So we understood that, and even if you look at what number of cross-country studies have done, that these are the typical solutions that we have, and it of course matches up with what our own priorities are as well. So this is where we went about and set our targets. So if I look at some of the mitigation related goals that we had, the commitments that India had, and just focus on what it is that it does for sustainable development as well. So by themselves, for mitigation action, they are very good commitments that we have. And they also have, in most cases, a positive impact on sustainable development. In the case of some of the mitigation commitments that I mentioned in the previous slide, we do have an accelerated access to energy that is going to be possible because of this focus on renewable energy that we have. 175 gigawatts going from almost not in a short period from 2014 to 2022. That's a hugely ambitious commitment that the country has taken on. It will also provide increased cost effectiveness because the cost of supplying energy to rural areas, in particular in India, was extremely high given the size of the country and given the dispersal of its population and the relatively low densities of population in rural areas. But if we have decentralized energy solutions that are today available, it's obviously going to result in cost effectiveness. There would be a value realization from using waste biomass and other waste products that are going to be available, which we have as a focus to convert that into energy forms. We will have access to safer, more secure mobility options because there are a number of steps which the government of India has taken in phasing out old vehicles, in moving to better quality fuels and vehicles, in investing tremendous amounts in mass rapid transit systems and so on. So each of these, all of the, and also in looking at the road infrastructure and now beginning to look at bicycle lanes and so on, because India does have a very large population that is dependent on bicycles as its modes of transportation, same way as China had a long while ago. So access to safer, more secure mobility options is going to be there, which is going to enable people to move more freely, to find jobs, to look at opportunities for improving their incomes and so on. So all very positive from this point of view. And contributing to life, all of the above is going to be contributing to livelihoods, poverty alleviation, health, education, water management, food security, nutrition, communications. All of these are going to be the co-benefits when we look at some of these actions that we are taking on the mitigation side. But then, as I was mentioning, I mean, have we just given these targets, or is there certain science behind it, or are we optimizing on the fact that we have set ourselves along this path and we can optimize over both the achievements for climate purposes and for sustainable development purposes? Examples that I've tried to put in very quickly for purposes of discussion more than anything else. Building in circular economy concepts for landfill management rather than just saying that we are going to be looking at extraction of methane and converting waste to energy as a blanket solution across the country. So that is one example where things can be done very differently provided we have all the data, we have all the analysis, we know what are the options that are available for looking at circular economy benefits from landfill management. Mapping of rural areas by socio-cultural economic context to propose a menu of solutions. The biggest challenge that we have in rural India, and we have been, it's not that we have started looking at access issues today, right? We have been working on it for the last 40 years at least. And in all this time period, we have not been able to achieve the end result that we want. It's a little easier in the context of the basic need of lighting. Extremely complex when you look at cooking. In fact, even today, we have nothing to offer in the whole cooking arena as far as India is concerned. There's barely anything that we can speak about in terms of progress. Yes, the only thing that we can do is say that we are going to provide LPG also in rural areas, and I don't think that's really going to solve the problem of climate change. So we need to have a very different approach and a very different understanding. And as we were mentioning in other events earlier, that we have, between all of us in this room, I'm sure, a large number of solutions that we all have experimented with at one time or the other. Some may have succeeded, some may have failed, but all of them have given us lessons. But we are not able to build on those lessons and then convert it into something that can become a solution, because we don't have those solutions that we can talk about. So, and we don't want to spend the time to sit back, reflect, debate, and come up with something like what I'm suggesting over there. Similarly, planning of urban expansion and redevelopment based on resource optimization. I can quote example after example, including the city that I live in on the outskirts of Delhi, where we have built the city and then started thinking about, oh, how do we move people? And do we have enough water? So these are, again, it probably falls, as items that need to be considered in urban planning between stools. It's probably that we have not thought through, because earlier these were not such major considerations, but today they are. But we are not attuned to thinking along those lines. Better design of public-private partnership models. We don't have a single, that's an exaggeration. We have very few public-private partnership models that are actually working. Similarly, if you look at carbon sinks, we are talking about creating carbon sinks through additional forest and tree cover. We can, in this case, seek to optimize the ecosystem services. If we have embarked on this particular program of afforestation to create carbon sinks, which is aligned to our climate agreement, then why can we not look at how we can, while doing this, optimize on the provision of ecosystem services? But today you still don't see a mapping of what is being done there and what can be done over there. Take into consideration forest-dependent communities. We have 300 million people in India who are forest-dependent, who are feeling constrained because of these various issues of how to manage forests, etc. But we can integrate them into the whole planning process and make them partners in this effort. But again, we are not really necessarily doing that. Understanding the impact of transformations in the industrial sector, for example, if the whole packaging industry is going to change and we are moving in different directions, then what will be the implications? How are the pressures on these resources going to change? And my time is up, so I'm just going to stop with this slide, which basically says that the third part of what we had in terms of the NDCs was to build this adaptive capacity to better adapt to climate change by enhancing investments and so on and so forth. And in my view, as far as adaptation is concerned, we are at a very different starting point. We really haven't even started thinking about it, and we don't have either the data or the analysis or the institutions, or it's really almost zero base that we really have to start from. And when we talk about taking integrated views, climate change, sustainable development goals, and within sustainable development goals, obviously there are interlinkages, and we want to take a systemic approach. I think we are far behind where we need to be. Thank you.
Leena, I would like to ask all panelists to come up now and join us here in the front. So Leena, please, and Maria Amparo, and then we also have Charles Tonui from ACTS, and Edith Adera from IDRC, and finally Asun and Clair also with us. Just pick your place. Yeah. Thank you. So we have heard now about the need for integrating action on climate change on adaptation to the impacts of climate change on the one hand, and the broader perspective of sustainable development as defined by the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs on the other hand. And at the same time, we have heard about the need of a well-structured interaction between science and policymakers. And actually, that would include probably resource managers, resource users as well, and to integrate, as Maria Amparo said, different types of knowledge also, not only scientific knowledge, but traditional, local knowledge. So this is a very complex affair, actually, we are facing here, and which we think is necessary. So as we have already listened to Leena and Maria Amparo, I would now like to invite the other three panelists to share some short initial thoughts on the topics of our panel with us. And I would like to start with Edith of Adera. She is has a senior position at IDRC, deals with Sub-Sahara focus, with a regional focus on Sub-Saharan Africa, and you are actually working in an integrated way on land, water, nutrition issues, so I think you are in a very good position to share your thoughts and experience with us.
Thank you very much for this opportunity and for the presentations that came earlier. I'd like to intervene drawing on a practical experience of what we've been supporting in Africa. In Africa, we realized, especially starting with the negotiations, that a lot of the negotiations were happening not much with scientific backup. So for the last 3 years, we've been working with a group of scientists from across Africa who've been embedded as part of the negotiation teams to provide technical support. Very quickly, we realized that the scientific evidence was absolutely critical in sort of like moderating the negotiations, in the sense that it was bringing the hard scientific evidence that would then form the basis of the discussions. And this started off before the Paris Agreement to date. And we've seen a very significant shift in the interaction between the scientists and the politicians. In Africa, they are structured quite well at the policy level. At the presidential level, you actually have a presidential committee on climate change. When it comes to the ministers, they've got a ministerial committee on climate change, and also the negotiators. But what was missing was the science. And bringing in the science, you could immediately see a difference. And I do agree with those who presented earlier about the need for transdisciplinary approach to bringing in science. Then you're able to bring in different perspectives within the discussions. The second thing was, so that raises the point of the institutional framework, which I think was addressed earlier by, I think, Maria in her presentation. It's absolutely critical to look at the institutional frameworks that you actually need to make these interactions happen. The second point was that, so while we are at a point where we do have the agreement, which to some extent is very well linked to the SDGs, the question now is to do with implementation. How then do we go about the implementation process? So a second point that I'd like to make is the need for multi-stakeholder platforms to be able to address the implementation aspects. So it's not just the policy makers and the scientists, but then you need to then bring in the other players, civil society, the private sector, as well as local communities. And in this, be able to address the issues from a holistic perspective, because there's a lot of interaction, and to some extent, climate is seen as cross-cutting, so to speak. The third point I'd like to make, if you look at a number of the documents that were prepared ahead of the Paris Agreement, like the NDCs, the NAPs that are currently under development, a lot of it was not informed by science. And so this is an opportunity for science to contribute to the reviews that are happening, to the reflections that are taking place at the national level. And so we are also looking at how then can the scientists come on board to actually support that process. So that's one area that we are looking at as well. Within that framework, a lot of these processes require funding. So the third point is that financial support is very critical when you're looking at multi-stakeholder processes and looking at science contributing in a very complex system. At the same time, you don't want these processes to be too donor dependent. So I think the issue of sustainability, issues of allowing these structures of science to sort of like run on their own without being too donor dependent is very critical. Then you have a point where support is not dependent on you getting funding, but you have creative ways to generate funding because there's demand for the work that you're doing. So very creative partnerships with national governments in looking at reviewing the critical documents they require, as well as in implementation. So I'd like to stop there and probably will contribute further as we go on.
Okay, thank you, Edith. And I would now like to move to Charles Tonui. I hope I pronounce your name right. You are a researcher at ACTS, which I always have trouble in remembering, but it's African Center for Technology Studies. You are located in Nairobi, and you are working also on these connected fields of climate change, water, and food security. So please, your take on our topic.
Yeah, thank you. I'll give the perspective whereby I'm trying to respond especially to some of the issues which were raised by TERI representative, especially the need for change, and what Edith mentioned, especially building the scientific evidence and looking at the implementation, funding and multi-stakeholder approach. And African Center for Technology Studies actually is kind of really taking up especially the multi-stakeholder approach, multidisciplinary approach, multi-sector approach. And what we have done, especially in terms of building evidence, is to lead in actually repackaging, doing data analysis, translating those scientific data into language that the Africans or other developing countries and the local communities can understand. For your information, we got some of the two recent publications. One is focusing on climate and environmental justice in Africa. And the second book is on enhancing adaptation to climate change in developing countries. So as an African-based institution and also looking at development in the African context, what should be the ACT's role and other think tanks enhance state actors? So ACT's approach is to look at the policy research to kind of what is really happening on the ground. How can we add value to the investment? And then again, look at the capacity gaps, and then who should train, who should facilitate, what are the capacity needs? And then also looking at the especially information dissemination. I think there was an issue of awareness, creation, and capacity building. When we look at the different projects which were funded, we are privileged to be funded quite a lot with by the IDRC, that is the International Development Research Center, and also DFID and UNEP. We have got this kind of understanding now that there is a need to really leverage research to the community level. The language that you look in the scientific peer-reviewed articles, even someone who has got language understanding or maybe English is very difficult to translate into something that can improve livelihood. There is the urgency in Africa to support adaptation, but how can we really invest on really synthesizing the science or translating to the language the communities can understand? So we got this approach also whereby IDRC and other donors are really supporting what you call Africa Sustainability Hub. This particular hub is to provide an opportunity for multi-stakeholder approach to get to give opportunity to different stakeholders to really share their views, criticize the government, criticize the research institution criticizing the government also challenging research institutions, and also the donors challenging institutions like ACTS. So that is the opportunity that we really have right now in terms of catalyzing action on adaptation. The second thing is about linking South-South. There is evidence that what is happening in Southern Asia, Latin America, and Africa there's quite a lot on science, technology, and innovation. There is innovative ideas. If you look at Kenya, there is what you call, it's a mobile-based banking system called M-Pesa. How do you utilize such a platform to leverage climate finance to those households which are affected by floods? Those families who want to take advantage of the existing markets to kind of sell their products. And lastly is how do we engage the policymakers, especially Africa, taking up their work in terms of really supporting the subnational governments, like for instance in Kenya. So there is a lot of opportunities, especially in looking at leveraging those support. For instance, in Kenya, one of the counties, including Isho, we have one called Isholo and Kitui, they've really moved forward in terms of really mobilizing climate funding at the community, at the county level. So we really need to kind of really invest, like what Edith said, in terms of funding, in terms of staff time, in terms of research, to really not only produce the scientific publications, but to kind of put into the language those particular targets can really understand. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. And we now move to Dr. Asun St. Clair. You are a social scientist, and I think in our context here, it's important to know that you are the UNFCCC Business and Industry Representative to the Adaptation Committee. And so you are putting a lot of your, you direct a research program at your enterprise, right? At the enterprise you're working for. And I think we also, so this means that we have a social science view, but also a view which may be referring also to private sector activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me clarify, I have my hat as a researcher, just so there is no problem with what I want to say. I want to bring to the discussion 3 points. They are, I think, repetitive to what my colleagues have already mentioned, but I want to say them nevertheless. The first is that at least within climate research and within the sort of overarching community of the IPCC, of which I was part during the AR5, humans are still missing. We need to acknowledge that the human beings are still missing, and I do have a paper that proves, because we did a linguistic analysis with a software trying to identify themes and topics of all the summaries for policymakers of the AR5, and the humans really are still missing. And that's a huge gap we somehow need to put on the table. When it comes to the SDGs and to the connections between the SDGs and the climate change, it's fantastic to see the success of the SDGs, and including and primarily also in the private sector. But I still see an important distance between communities of research and action with the traditional development research community, which is where I come from many years ago, the critical poverty studies, which is very driven by social science, by critical social science. And a lot of the challenges we are trying to address with the implementation of the SDGs, and now with the increasing complexity of adding on coping with climate change, we really need to learn how difficult it was to do research that makes development happen, and how difficult it was, the lessons at the level of government on how national and local government organizations need to integrate across sectors and so on and so forth. And we have heard about the importance of distinguishing what works at the global level may not necessarily have the granularity that is needed at the national and at the local level. So I would like to sort of make the call not to forget that there is this very large body of knowledge that we need to be working with and learn from. My second point relates to the science policy, which has also been mentioned. And there is still a false dichotomy, certainly very much in the climate change community, less so in the development, and perhaps less so on the discussions on sustainability. But I was just in another room a while ago with Johan Rockström, who said it took 25 years from the scientific community insights to show we are touching on those planetary boundaries, to policy really reacting, wait a second, this is a serious issue. We don't have 25 years, again, to move now to the next. So the science policy gap is extremely important. Not enough science is co-designed, is co-produced with the stakeholders. And we need a lot more of that, because it has to be co-designed and co-produced, and at the same time be policy relevant, be translated locally, as my colleague was rightly pointing out. The organizations that make science remain very disciplinary. Partnerships across countries are difficult and expensive. Not everybody funds them properly. And science for society is not really the mainstream. So it's not that I want to bring the bad news, but I think we also need to see the actual problems we have with the whole machinery of universities and research institutes that were made for a world that no longer exists. My third point brings the private sector to play. One of the key societal stakeholders we need to be working with is business and industry. How do we mobilize business climate action? We see in COPs there are serious groups of large companies through the Women Business Coalition, associations like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, really mobilizing, really trying to demonstrate that there is a business case for sustainability. But research on organization and management also shows that this business case is actually perhaps not an ideal way to look at it. So what I want to bring here to the discussion is that the poor understanding that we have on climate about the humans translates also into what many businesses are doing. We keep looking for an instrumental case that may not exist, or at least that needs to coexist with a paradox. Sustainable Development Goals pose a serious paradox for all companies and for most for-profit organizations, unless they really work on the sustainability business, which is a minority. So there is very interesting research emerging from this other area on business and management, saying maybe we should be thinking about this paradox perspective, where what we need to put forward is understanding not the business case and the for-profit case, but to say that companies need to be doing both at the same time, because otherwise these 2030 goals would never happen, considering the way in which the global economy works and the sort of not necessarily positive financial environment and inequalities in which we live. So this paradox perspective acknowledges the tensions between desirable yet interdependent and conflicting sustainability objectives. And that's a gap that I think many of us in this community can also address through creating those partnerships that our colleague from TERI was mentioning. And I'm very glad that Future Earth Germany hosts this panel, because Future Earth is perhaps one of the areas where we are trying to, through the knowledge action networks, come up with those issues, and perhaps we need to do one more on paradoxes with the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have opened the perspective of this, the topics, and we need to discuss more even, but I think many of the points you three have made now deepen and illustrate points which have been made by the two speakers in the beginning. So we heard about the benefits support to science can bring to better informed participation in climate negotiations, but also in defining national climate policies, NDCs. And we heard about the need to translate that to be able to translate scientific findings into a language which is understandable, but which also connects to the needs and the perspectives of local stakeholders. And finally, Asun, you made the point, how are these different scientific communities conversing with each other? I remember when the debate on adaptation to climate change started, all experiences with development research were not, it was like reinventing the wheel. That was my strong perception at that time. And the other point you make is about how do scientists address the role of private sector, but also of governments in fulfilling the transformative function they actually have in implementing transformation pathways, both from the perspective of climate policy and the perspective of sustainable development, because it means that they need to redefine their function and their responsibilities, not only look at producing policy results, but at interacting within governments in a new fashion. And as you say, private sector cannot only look for the return on investment in private terms, but should also think again about investing into the commons, both the local commons and the global commons. So what would be your reaction to this, Leena and Maria Amparo, because you have been listening now to these very interesting statements and you should have an opportunity to contribute as well.
I was a little distracted just now, so please carry on. Well, thank you very much. There are a lot of different items, but I want to take some of your words that I think that could be key, and some other words of my colleagues. One of them is the difference between our communities. The communities that even then in many times we are scientists and then we are policy makers, but it's some kind of difference that even that you understand the other are the limitations to the relationship, I would say. For example, one of that is timing. The timing is a very difficult concept that we are that we manage in a different way in the scientific community and in the decision makers. Then I think that even when the thematic in my country, for example, of climate change and about sustainable development really starts in the academic or in the scientific field, now is more in the decision makers field, and then how to communicate when I used to say that we need to be rigorous, but to have the opportunity to act, because sometimes we have communities that, that is true. In science, you need long-term studies, projects, then, and that are in another, maybe in another timing that decision makers need. That's one of the limitations that I saw in the relationships. And another, I want to talk about all your the points. Is not possible, but one other thing that I believe that is very important is the word transformational, because what we need is not the same things that we are used to do, but absolutely a change. We need a structural change to think different about to base the decision makers based on science, and we need transformational thinking in both in many sides, in the side of the decision makers, the governments, and in the sides of the scientists of how to manage this relationship, and thinking that is not only another way to make the same things. Sustainable development and climate change is challenging all our paradigms, and we need really to go for a change in the structures. We learn the science, we communicate science, we use the science for decisions. Then I think that we have a very rich area to develop together, because we are among the countries, we are in a similar level of in this problematic, I think.
Thank you. Maybe, Leena, you could also comment on, because I found your point about South-South cooperation very important. And we were on a conference yesterday where we discussed also on, is South-South cooperation based on more trust than North-South cooperation? Is that a perspective. Is there progress made on which joint action could build, or what is needed to increase trust in international cooperation as well? Because we see that the gaps of knowledge, but also of resources, are so large that this transformation is not possible without more cooperation and different cooperation. Leena.
Well, I'll address that in just a couple of other points, if you will allow me, and I'll try and make it very quick once again. But the point that I was making was that science and our studies are typically done with a purpose of unraveling a particular mystery or trying to understand certain relationships and so on. And more often than not, there are a lot of assumptions that are built into it. So you do something at one level, but when you translate it to another level, you have to be careful about the assumptions that have been made and the purpose for which a particular study or analysis has been undertaken, which can be very different. And that's where I was talking about the abstractions and the granularity. But in the communication, we often either tend to forget to mention it, or we don't pay attention to it, either way, right? So, and that's when then we land up into a situation where we believe, and I was just witness to this earlier this morning, that we have all the answers because somebody has done some study somewhere in some other context, and we believe that it can be adopted and we can just jump into the implementation. That doesn't happen. So that, I think, is something that we all definitely need to watch out for and recognize the need that there is a need for a lot more science studies at national and subnational level. So that was one. Second, the inclusion of the private sector is critically important, but and again, the contexts vary enormously, but I do find that it is not necessary that all private sectors, no matter how large or small, understand the reasons why we would want them to invest, rather than just look at returns and what is in it for them. When you talk to the corporates, they say, yes, we understand the need for sustainability, and we are willing, and especially the 3 pillars, because now they have fully accepted the 3 pillars of sustainable development, may not be everything else that we are talking about. But I think it would be wrong to say that if government was to provide the regulation, then industry will just fall in place. I think it is critically important that industry also understands and is fully conversant with the need for their engagement with the kinds of issues that we are talking about and for the long term. But that is not necessarily the case. So that science communication part of it that some of us were talking about earlier has to be with government, science policy, but also science corporate. And then there has to be a consensus on the way forward, an agreed approach. That is not necessarily always the case. The third point which you had just asked me just went out of my head. SouthSouth Cooperation. SouthSouth Cooperation, again, critically important, but we discussed this over the weekend in another conference as well. And what emerged from there, from some interactions that we had, was that it's not necessary that there is a higher degree of trust in South-South cooperation as compared to North-South cooperation. But the difference could be that the situations, the contexts are much more similar in the South-South arena, and therefore a translation of what might be successful in one context would be simpler in another southern context than from the north to the south, which is what I was mentioning in my first point as well. So I think we need to understand the advantages and only build on those, but not necessarily always mean that there is trust or no trust. I don't think that's the point.
Thank you. I would like to give you 3 the opportunity to react also and maybe enter into an interaction here on the panel. So yeah, and then I'm sorry, I think we are coming to the end of the panel because there will be also some concluding remarks by Martin and Asun. And I think that is important to see what are the ways forward for promoting this, the necessary interaction between policy implementation and science. So Edith.
Just want to make 3 points. One to do with the South-South Cooperation, but just to mention that actually even there's need for intra-South cooperation. You find that even within the South, not many scientists are connected among themselves. So the idea of interconnection within is very critical. And once you strengthen that, then you also strengthen the South-South cooperation. And I totally agree that it doesn't necessarily mean that there's more trust if it's South-South compared to South-North. I guess what's important is the capacities and the issues that are being dealt with. And when you build the confidence and the interaction within, then it even strengthens cooperation across the board. So you really don't have scientists isolated, but you actually have them working together as a body. The second point that I wanted to make is to do with, I think, the point that Martin raised about the joined-up agenda, where you're looking at climate and you're looking at SDGs. Increasingly, a lot of governments are finding it very laborious to begin to track, to report on some of these agendas. So the more we look at the integration and the more we look at how they sort of address a complex issue, the better. And that does help in terms of reporting and in terms of seeing their development from a holistic perspective. The third point I want to touch on is the issue of co-design, co-production, and I think I would add co-sharing. I find that where there is more of co-design, co-production, co-sharing, you build trust, you walk the journey together. So to some extent, it addresses the point that Maria was a bit concerned about, where you find that the timing between science and policy is very different. But when you co-design and co-produce, policymakers tend to walk the journey and pick what they need to pick along the way. Be able to quickly ask for support because you've built that trust in addressing some policy decisions they need to make, with the understanding that the process is still ongoing and they're aware of the scientific process and they're aware of the interim results. So it builds trust and it also increases the uptake of knowledge. At least that's what we've seen in the previous example that I gave, where we had negotiators working with the policymakers, scientists working with the negotiators and the policymakers. We actually realized that because they had built trust with the scientists, these are the policymakers, a number of them were drawing the scientists to their national processes and asking them, we are currently working on a NAP or an NDC, can we draw you in? Because they've built that trust. So I think walking that journey together is very critical. Yeah.
Thank you. Charles?
Yes, I think also we need to acknowledge the national level, who are the responsible institutions who are mandated to support research, especially in the scientific field. And we have the National Commission for Science, Technology and Innovation, and I appreciate IDRC, DFID, and National Research Foundation in South Africa. We are part of the technical agencies really supporting the national science research councils in 14 countries in Africa to really look at the mobilization of resources and investment in research and science. That will kind of now support, especially building the human resource support in terms of supporting master's students, undergraduate and PhD students to really focus on science and how those particular science output build on or support the livelihoods, especially in the agricultural sector, which is a priority for Africa in terms of adaptation. So I think there is need for investment. And on the institutional support, like I agree with the other speakers, and also enhance the funding, especially towards leveraging those research output to the ground level. How do we support the extension officers? Some of the studies we did, especially in East Africa, you find the extension officers, they are well equipped. They work with their research and national research bodies, but they don't have support in terms of reaching out to farmers on regular basis. So those are some of the areas that we need to focus on. And then especially also on data. Data is a resource. We talk of oil, petroleum and others, but data is something that has attracted especially stakeholders, political players. how do you build a database whereby you archive data that is valid, that is accepted by different stakeholders? I appreciate government of Morocco, Kenya. They've already installed the open data bottle. In Kenya, sometimes back in 2015, we hosted with the Office of the Deputy President the climate and data session in one of the conferences in Nairobi. So we need to invest also on data that is accepted by different stakeholders. Say that when we kind of build different case studies in such applications like this and disseminate, then we have a buy-in. We have got that trust that we are actually collecting real data. So it depends on the tools and the kind of support and bringing stakeholders together. We really need to invest on especially systems that are efficient, systems that are inclusive in terms of reaching to different stakeholders. Thank you.
Asun, is there something you want to add without wrapping up already?
No, but just a point of clarification. What I was trying to say is that industries need to understand what are the challenges for themselves and for society, because there is not such a thing as a resilient organization without being part of a resilient society. And that means this paradox perspective, you need to be looking at the common good at the same time you pursue the private good. And also to make a very important distinction between the large companies, corporations, and the SMEs, the small and medium enterprises, which are the real important actors in many countries in the world. And it's not that easy for them to really engage with any of these issues, and least so to engage with the common good without really having support from other parts of society.
Yeah, thank you. Leena, you had wanted to add a point.
Since you asked us to discuss amongst ourselves and take up issues, right? No, I just wanted to put in a note of caution on joined up agendas. Because it's almost convenient to do a mapping, which I think when we look at studies that have been done, a lot of studies that have been done on interlinkages between SDGs, we have tried to look at and map the interlinkages, and we have tried to map the strength of interlinkages and the direction of the interlinkages, either positively reinforcing or negatively reinforcing and so on. But I think whether it is a developing country or a developed country, we have not moved the next step to really say that, okay, so recognizing these and this, how do you operationalize this? How do you operationalize the delivery of integrated outcome, which would be in a sense optimal, if there's any such word as that. So it's almost romantic to think about being able to do something like this, and of course it is easier to deal with in terms of reporting requirements and so on. But I think the question that is critically important that we ask ourselves is that, are we looking upon these as obligations that have to, and responsibilities that have to be undertaken, or are we taking full ownership of whatever it is that we are also committing at an international level? And I'm raising this because it's not always necessarily the case. Thank you.
Well, only quickly to add, I absolutely agree. And I would say that taking into account that sometimes one of the problems are the proposals of the purposes of some project, of some activity, and the other. I think that the Paris Agreement or the NDCs for each country and the SDGs are really a good opportunity to have research lines. We can take it like the questions that we need to solve together, and could be that that are the meeting point to make some advancement at the same time in science and in policies. And I think that if we can share more and more with all the communities, with the private sector, with that we have that point there, we have national goals, but they are in the international or in the global dimension that we need to put together the knowledge that we already have and to have innovation and to get more knowledge about many things. I think that are a very good points to arrive.
Yeah. Thank you. I think what we have now, we discussed a lot about science policy interaction, and sort of our implicit starting point, what I got from all my panelists here, is that we believe firmly that there are benefits in thinking about joint implementation and joint policy design between the two agendas, the 2030 agenda and the climate agenda, because achieving sustainable development is obviously the overarching goal for both. What we did not look at very much at the panel now are trade-offs and tensions between these sets of policy objectives, and neither we did not look at such tensions and trade-offs in the short term or in the long term. And I think that is something where this was mentioned by Martin, and this is the content of several of the publications you mentioned in your introductory slides. And I think that this is what we know from policy practice. We know from policy debates, whether we talk about the global level, the national or the local level, some people say this is not possible because then it will hinder me to achieve this other goal. So how do I move out of coal? That's the debate we're having in Germany, if I don't want to make large sections of the country unemployed. And the question actually which needed to be asked is, what is my midterm scenario for avoiding that? Yeah. And I think what I understood from you is that and I share that, the belief that it's absolutely necessary to invest in science, in local production of solutions, in local production of analysis, so that the global strategies can become meaningful at local level. Before I hand over to Martin and Asun for the wrapping up, I want to draw your attention to work which is ongoing in my institute. We have an interconnections zone. Our institute is located right in between this zone and the place where the negotiations are happening. And we have more than 40 side events which focus on the interconnections between these two agendas. So if you want to have more precise and more focused debates and knowledge sharing, please come and visit us at our location. If you want more information, Sander is there. Maybe you just stand up because he is one of the organizers of that. And then I also want to draw your attention to a tool we developed together with the Stockholm Environment Institute and ACTS. That is, you see it over there on the standing thing, and you have a QR code. This is an online tool for analyzing interactions between NDCs and SDGs. And so this can also be maybe useful for your own knowledge endeavors. So thank you all for having joined us here for this joint side event. And now I hand over to Martin and Asun. Thank you. Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much.
So, colleagues, if somebody is missing something from the cloakroom, I think, you can come to the podium here, pick it up. I think we had a rich debate about catalyzing climate actions and realizing the SDGs. Asun, how are you going to take this forward?
We are not coordinated, so we both use our brains to. So I have 3 key points.
Sure.
And
I'll add
yours?
to those. Yes.
You want me to start?
Yes, please.
Okay, so just not to repeat, I have decided to sort of make 3 key points to summarize the discussion partly. and also to pose further questions. So the first is that, are we overambitious? And I think that many of the presentations were raising questions, challenges that might be related to this potential idea that we are overambitious. We have this huge, enormous challenge of a world below 2 degrees that very often, one holds the breath. Is that going to happen or not? And then the Sustainable Development Goals, which are just down the road. The dangers of joining up agendas, the risk of repetition, of not breaching sufficiently traditions and literatures and research and action, and producing something that is not sufficiently meaningful from a global, national, and local levels. My second point is about trust. I think many of the speakers have raised issues related to what are the issues that prevent trust from building and what are the issues that may enable the trust to be built up. To be on the positive side, I think there was quite a large agreement, even if some of our colleagues didn't use the terminology of co-design and co-production, certainly co-sharing as a way to build trust, to walk the talk, to bring in along your stakeholders into the design and into the results, and perhaps even leading towards data that can be trusted. And lastly, about the role of science. Definitely we need partnerships between policy, society, and science, but those are better said than done. We need to still build more knowledge, basic knowledge. At least I understood that we still need some basic science at the local and at the national level, and that's extremely important to maintain. And a very strong push, that will be my last argument because I have to, I will say we need a very strong push for the social sciences, for the critical social sciences, and from the humanities, particularly from the South, not Western traditions, but from the South.
Thank you, Asun, for the great summary. And I think I'll take for a moment the scientific perspective, but then add some other flavors. I was very pleased to hear the panelists voicing strong support about the factual generation of knowledge that is rooted in observations. Those observations are made available to databases in a fair and equitable and open way. I heard a lot of support from that from the panel, which I personally share, and I think in these days that's more important than ever that we have that, and also some authority about that information, that observation, that databases. Certainly, there's no challenge on that we need to distill, walk through these analyses, and these are what academic institutions do. But I think what's more important is that we want to assess a bit the knowledge. And I understood from the panelists, and I thought it was a very important point, it's wonderful to have a global climate assessment that gives you motivation, that gives you understanding. But when you want to come in the action space, most of the action happens at the local level. And so there are scales in between, and it was not obvious to some of the panelists how in their region, whether the knowledge actually exists to take some of the global goals, the global aspirations, and actually operationalize them in their region. I think there's a clear need for that scientific policy science debate at the local or regional level, because most of the actions are specific, and social sciences certainly informs us in that, but also natural sciences is different in different regions, and I think we clearly saw a very strong articulation from the partners here that that is an area where much more energy, investment, and thought is needed to really build up that capacity at the local and regional level to, in a science-informed way, to make the next steps. They understand that the global goals, the global ambition is there, there's some global understanding on that, but really bringing it down to the local and regional level, I think is an action that I think we can collectively take, not only on the policy side, but also on the science side, that we need to develop those. I saw wonderful support for the science policy, maybe business debate, and I think we heard remarks about how that changed countries' behavior when the policy debates were enriched by a scientist or two joining them. And I was really happy to hear that. Quite often I'm travel more the circles where the scientists say, you know, we need to be heard, you know, we need to be sort of making our message heard. And here I think this debate was different. It's basically coming more from the policy side, said that the policy debates were actually enriched and more solid when you have these partnerships. But what it does take is on both sides a recognition of languages are different, frames are different. You mentioned the timeline. Scientists are thorough. They don't want to work tomorrow. Politicians need to decide tomorrow. They don't want to wait for 3 years for a deep science analysis. There's many areas I think we can work on together. I really enjoyed that plea for literacy. Climate literacy, but in general, science literacy. I think a science literate world is what this community here and this panel meant is really important. And when we look around the global media, some of the policymakers, we're not so sure that science literacy is on the main agenda. There are certainly some agendas that seem to be walking away from that. They have other literacies that they would like to see rather than rooted in science or deep understanding. And I really was happy to hear all the panelists making a strong push for that. And I think it's our, in the scientific world, I think our obligation to cast our science insight in language, in words that can be understood by the non-experts. Asun and I know what we're talking about. That's easy for us to say, but actually using language that is articulate, that is to the point and helpful for those who have a short amount of time, who don't have the same academic rich background that some of you have. So that is also a capacity building arena, that literacy, and doing that in a forward-looking way. And then I'm going to close with on the statement on these joined up agendas. There was a bit of controversy, I heard. Leena was warning us a bit and saying, yeah, that's kind of okay, but maybe not so helpful. And so I want to bring a word in that wasn't used, that is policy coherence. Now, when you work for a development agency in the UK, in Germany, in Sweden, that is our main problem. Because we have so many projects which are all good intentions, all wonderful, but it's unclear if they actually add up. And I think Leena is getting nervous a bit. I don't think she was critical about that, but I do want to bring in this area of policy coherence, and that is where the joined up agendas really help. Because it allows you to take your climate policy and put it in line with your set of development policy or reduction of hunger policy, water policy. There's many policies that most nations have in one way or another. And these joined up agendas help you a bit more for policy coherence. They're not easier, they're actually harder. So I agree from that point of view. It's an extra level of friction, of overhead, and sometimes it's easier to just go down a track. I'm a marine scientist, I love the ocean, I'd love to implement SDG 14, but you do know that you might have to at times do the harder work and see where your friends and foes are. And if you do that extra work, I think that extra mile gets you somewhere on the long run. But I think we understand on the short one, that could be an excuse for non-action, and we don't want to see that. So there's a bit of a tension there. I think we have to look at that together. So these are my points I took away from that, but I'm going to hand over to Asun again because I know she wants to add 1 or 2 dimensions to that. No? Go for it. You happy?
Well, I think we missed, what our audience has to say in general. I still get the sense that in our conclusions, what we show is not necessarily a coherent pathway forward, but I wanted to say, I think that's okay. Because I think one of the risks is to, yes, we want join-up agendas, you want policy coherence, but we do not necessarily need to agree on absolutely everything. I think this is a critical moment, a crossroads where we just need to mobilize. So in a sense, let me be very practical and unscientific. Whatever works, if it doesn't harm, I think we should move forward.
And I like that point of view because of what it does do, it connects, Leena, what you were saying. Actions in one region of the world might be just the right way forward, and it will not work at all in another way. So there's no one solution. So that gives you encouragement and hope to actually go forward, be bold, try things out, be reflective at times, see what worked, see what didn't work, and share your experience. Thanks for coming. I wish we had more time to engage all of you. I know they had plenty of questions, but we are finishing on time, so you can catch some of the speakers here and ask your question to them. Thanks for coming. Thanks for all the sponsors for hosting us, and what a wonderful panel I had. I'll make a hashtag under the panel. No white male on the panel. Thank you.